In this lesson, we will talk about what is Global Illumination or GI in Vray and 3ds Max, or how we also call it indirect illumination. So it's basically a group of algorithms or a group of techniques used in 3D computer graphics to create that realistic light, or how we call it, a photorealistic light. Let's take a look at this image. You can see here three elements. First, we got the light source, and our light source creates our direct light. The direct light also creates our shadows. If we would get to max, we can see that if we move from Vray to GI, we can see here enable GI. Well, if our direct light hits the surface and this GI is not enabled, we will get those dark shadows. When the GI is enabled, then we will get the reflection of light. You can see here the image of reflected light, and we can say that this is the light source, and this light source shoots rays, and when they hit the first surface, they must reflect at the same angle, and we got a reflected ray. So if we would cut this process into a half, well, in real world we cannot do this, but in 3ds Max we can. So if we would divide this into two parts, in the first part, our direct light, it's actually creating the first light hit from the source until it hits the first surface. So we can say that what we see here in direct light, it's our first half. From the light source or from our window, we are shooting rays. In this case, we have one ray on this image, but here we have thousands or millions of rays. And until they hit the surface, and you can see even here the direct light shoots rays, and they will stop when they hit a surface. This is the first phase, when our direct light hits our surface. And you can see the shadows, the dark shadows, they are still not calculated using the GI to create the realistic shadows. Let's take a look at this image. Here we can see the principle that we talked about in the previous lessons. And if we would have a light source, it will create the shadows. Well, our light source is not one point, but in this case it traces from one point rays towards the edges of our objects. So when we create those shadows, we are actually talking about the first phase. Now the second phase, it's about the reflected light. Well, this reflected light actually creates the second phase of our lighting in the scene, and it creates that realism or photorealism that we are talking about. If we would look here, we can see that reflections, refractions, and shadows are all GI. Well, in this case, we're talking about reflection, but the shadows and refractions as well. Let's try actually to simulate the same situation we got in our images in Photoshop, so it will be a lot more clear. It's the same thing like here. From our window, this is the light source, the Vray light source, and the direct light, which is actually our Vray light, shoots rays. It shoots thousands or even millions of rays, and they will stop until they hit a surface. So we got a light. This is our light source, the Vray light, and I will rotate it 90 degrees, and I will install it like in our images. It will be the light coming from our window. In this case, this is the light source, and it emits the first light or the direct light. Until that light, like you see here, direct light shoots rays, and they will stop until they hit a surface. Well, we don't have a wall there, but the GI will work anyway. So GI by default, it's enabled. So if we will get to max, you can see the GI, it's enabled, and we will leave it enabled. And after the direct light, it's emitting that rays will stop creating the first phase when they hit the first surface. So from this light, we are shooting rays, and those rays will stop on this part, on this surface of our armchair. So it's the same thing like on this image. After we emit light, the direct light, and it hits a surface, you can see we are getting those shadows, those dark shadows. This means that our first phase, it's done. And from this point, when we hit a surface, we must start, when we enable GI, the second phase of reflected light or reflected rays. And when this second phase starts, we are getting two more elements. We are getting the primary bounces, and you can see the primary bounces uses this primary engine. By default, we are using brute force, but we also got irradiance map. Well, we will stick to brute force. Irradiance map got its pluses and minuses as well. You can see here the settings. It got also a series of presets. By default, it's set to high. You can switch from default and advanced, but we will stick for now with brute force. So in the first engine we will enable brute force, and in the second we will enable light cache. Light cache, it is used to create the secondary bounces. Let's get back a bit to this image. We said that our camera shoots rays. We also got a light source, and when the camera or primary rays hits a surface, a sample is created. Well, from that sample we also shoot rays in our scene, and with GI enabled, those rays will continue to bounce and gather information from the scene. This will create our realism or photorealism in our render. So with every bounce of the surfaces in the scene, rays lose their power or energy. If we would continue those rays on our image, we can say that from these points they will bounce and bounce and bounce until they fade out. But in Vray, rays bounce a limited number of times. This influences the render time and the scene brightness as well. By every bounce we got a bit brighter scene. That's why on this part of the image you can see lighter shadows, and the upper part we see dark shadows. It's because of this GI and this reflected light. And also those samples add information not only about shadows but also about reflections and refractions. So in conclusion, first of all, our camera ray hits a surface and a sample is created. These rays are called primary rays. Next, from these samples we are also shooting rays, and they are called secondary rays. They gather additional information about the surfaces around them, including the lights as well. So we can see here that reflections, refractions and shadows are all GI, and with GI enabled, rays will continue to bounce and gather information from the scene. So basically when we enable GI, we are creating the reflections, refractions and shadows, and all these it's called GI. In Vray, we enable here GI, and we will use from now on brute force for our primary bounce, and we will use light cache for our secondary bounces. You can see, by the way, the light settings here. We will talk about brute force and light cache as well. Well, this is the principle of global illumination in Vray and 3ds Max.